Hernán Cortés didn't just conquer an empire, he also destroyed his own family from the inside. For centuries, they've told you about the man who brought down Moctezuma, the conquistador who laid Mexico's gold at the feet of Spain's king, the hero or the villain who changed a continent's history forever. But almost nobody has told you this. Hernán Cortés's deepest crime wasn't political or military. It was intimate. It was family. And he committed it against his children. Because while he raised cities on the ruins of indigenous worlds and wrote letters dripping with glory to the emperor, Cortés was doing something far darker. He was using his children like pieces on a board, where the only things that mattered were power, blood, purity, and his sick obsession with building a perfect dynasty. One of those children ended up locked inside a monastery alone, shivering with cold, hating the man who sent him there. Another, the favorite, was prepared from the cradle to inherit a marquisate built on indigenous blood. A daughter died at 16 after a never-ending childbirth, used as a bargaining chip in a marriage she never chose. Others vanished into convents, hospitals, anonymous graves, and hanging over all of them is a shadow that poisons everything, a possible twin son. A nameless child who would have lived and died waiting for a brother he was never allowed to know existed. The official story talks about the conqueror. Today you're going to meet the father, and I'm warning you, he's more monstrous than the soldier. This is the story Spanish history books never tell all the way through. Here you'll discover the secret Will Cortés wrote 3 days before he died, the letter his legitimate son sent to the king, begging him to execute his bastard brothers, and the document that proves one of Cortés's children disappeared under circumstances so strange his body was never found. Hernán Cortés had 11 confirmed children. 6 were illegitimate. 2 were born to Aztec princesses. 1 tried to murder his own brother for an inheritance. Another was shut away in a monastery to silence him. But there's a 12th child almost nobody talks about, an identity so dangerous the Spanish crown spent fortunes trying to erase him from history. We'll come back to that ghost son. Picture this. An indigenous woman holds a mixed-blood baby in her arms, watching her Spanish lover sign papers that legitimize the child as heir to the most brutal empire in the Americas. That baby would become the first noble mestizo in history, and his existence unleashed a succession war so bloody, so calculated, and so buried that it changed the destiny of 2 continents all the way to today. Cortés is 34 when he steps onto Mexican soil in 1519. He arrives with 600 men, 16 horses, and an obsession that goes beyond gold, to found a dynasty that will last for centuries. Cortés isn't a beginner at using indigenous women as political tools. In Cuba, he had already perfected the strategy: seduce, impregnate, abandon. He left at least 3 illegitimate children on that island. None inherited anything. To Cortés, they were failed experiments. But Mexico would be different. 3 weeks after arriving, Cortés receives a gift from the chiefs of Tabasco. 20 enslaved women, a diplomatic gesture. Among them, one stands out, about 20 years old, fluent in Nahuatl and Maya, daughter of fallen nobles. Her own mother sold her into slavery after remarrying and having a son who needed to inherit without competition. Her original name was Malinali Tenapal. The Spaniards baptized her Marina. History would remember her as La Malinche, the traitor, the mother of the mestizos, the most hated woman in Mexico. Cortés looks at her and sees something his men don't. He doesn't see a woman. He sees a key that can open every door of the Aztec Empire. He makes her his translator that same week and his lover 3 days later. Not for love, for pure strategy. Because Malinche doesn't just translate words. She translates cultures, military logic, ancient rivalries. Without her, Cortés would never have understood that the Tlaxcalans hated the Mexica more than they feared the Spaniards. Without her, he would never have negotiated the alliances that handed him 100,000 indigenous warriors to besiege Tenochtitlan. And without her, he would never have had his first mestizo son, the son who would change everything. 3 years later, in 1522, Malinche gives birth in a stone house that once belonged to an Aztec noble Cortés had executed. The labor lasts 18 hours. Brutal. No Spanish doctors are available, only indigenous midwives Cortés barely tolerates in the room. It's a boy. Cortés looks down at the baby when he's only minutes old, brown skin, dark eyes already carrying the intensity of his Spanish father, and Cortés sees something no other conquistador had seen before. The future of the New World, incarnated in flesh and blood. He names him Martín Cortés. And that first Martín is a Spanish name, a Christian name, a name meant to erase any trace of the indigenous mother. Because years later, Cortés will have another son with his Spanish wife, and he will name him Martín too. Two Martins, one mestizo, born from the conquistador and the enslaved woman. One pure Spanish, born from the conquistador and a noblewoman. Just sit with that for a second. Your father has another child. He gives him your exact name, and then he decides that one will inherit everything while you get the leftovers. How long would it take before you started planning revenge? But in that moment, little Martín, the mestizo, is Cortés's only living child. And Cortés does something unthinkable. He recognizes him publicly. He gives him his surname before a notary. He declares him a legitimate son with inheritance rights. Why would he risk his reputation by recognizing a mestizo child in an era when blood purity was everything? Because his Spanish wife, Catalina Juarez, had died just 6 months earlier. She died in the bed she shared with Cortés. She had bruises on her neck. Servants heard screams that night. They heard objects breaking. They heard Catalina begging. The official version was sudden death by natural causes. But all of Mexico whispered the truth. Hernán Cortés strangled his wife. Why? The stories differ. Some say Catalina confronted him over his constant affairs with indigenous women. Others say she threatened to return to Cuba and denounce him to Spanish authorities for abuse of power. Cortés was never tried for her death, but the shadow of suspicion followed him for years. With Catalina dead and no legitimate Spanish heir, Martín the Mestizo becomes the only continuation of the Cortés name in the Americas. And Cortés needs that. He needs to prove he has founded something permanent on conquered land. So he legitimizes the Mestizo boy with perfectly legal notarial documents. But there's something else, something Cortés never put in those public papers. There is a letter Malinche wrote 2 years later in 1524. It was lost for centuries, and then it was found in 1992 in an Inquisition archive in Seville, hidden among documents about indigenous witchcraft. The letter is written in broken Spanish. Malinche had learned to write, but her grammar is imperfect, full of Nahuatl structures translated literally. And what she says is devastating. Señor Hernán, you hand me to another man as if I were a breeding mare. After I gave you a son who carries your blood and your name. After I translated every word that conquered this empire. Juan Jaramillo doesn't want me. I don't want him. But you order, and I obey, as I have always obeyed. Martín asked me every night, why don't you live with us? Why do other children have fathers who hold them? And he only has a mother. What do I tell him? That his father has a new Spanish woman. That I am no longer useful for anything except giving birth. That I was useful to conquer but not to remain at your side. Cortés receives the letter and ignores it completely. He doesn't even reply. He marries Malinche off to Juan Jaramillo, one of his captains, in a formal Catholic ceremony. Malinche is 25. Jaramillo is 52. The marriage is exile disguised as respect. Cortés removes her from Mexico City, sending her to live on a remote hacienda outside Orizaba, then 200 kilometers away, and he keeps Martín. He tells Malinche it's for the boy's education, that a Cortés son can't be raised on a provincial estate, that he needs Spanish schooling, European manners, preparation to inherit an empire. Malinche accepts, not because she wants to, but because she has no choice, because she is an indigenous woman in a world ruled by Spanish men. And over the next 5 years, she sees her son exactly 4 times. Supervised visits, watched conversations, Spanish servants who don't allow Malinche to speak to Martín in Nahuatl. Cortés is systematically erasing the indigenous half of his son. He is creating a mestizo who thinks Spanish, speaks Spanish, acts Spanish. 5 years later, Malinche dies. The official cause, sudden fevers. She's around 30. Some modern historians suspect smallpox. Others think dysentery. But there's a third, darker theory based on the testimony of a friar who attended her in her final days. The friar wrote in his diary, "Marina died in agony after 3 days of fevers. Her last words were in her native tongue. She called for her son. She kept repeating a name that was not Martina Mexica name I could not understand. It seemed she was confessing something important, something about two instead of one, but she died before I could comprehend." What name did Malinche repeat as she died? No one recorded it. And what did two instead of one mean? The friar didn't understand. But we'll come back to that phrase, because it's the key to the entire mystery. Martin is 7 when his mother dies. They don't let him attend the funeral. They tell him his mother went to heaven to be with God, and that 7-year-old mestizo, motherless, with a father too busy consolidating an empire to hold him, while he cries, becomes the first link in a chain of tragedy that will last generations. But this is where the story gets complicated, because Cortés has a new problem. He has just remarried. His new wife is Juana de Zúñiga. She's 17. She is the niece of the Duke of Béjar, one of the most powerful families in Spain. The marriage isn't love, it's pure political strategy, because back in Spain, King Charles the Mercim has opened a formal investigation against Cortés. The charges are many: the murder of Catalina Juarez, systematic abuse of power, illicit enrichment, executions without trial. Cortés needs powerful allies at court, and the fastest way to get them is to marry high nobility. Juana arrives in Mexico months later and meets Martin, the 7-year-old mestizo boy, living in her new husband's house. Juana looks at Martin. Martin looks back with those dark eyes that have already seen too much loss, and Juana understands instantly that child is an existential problem. Not because Martin is violent or difficult. The opposite, he's polite, intelligent, speaks perfect Spanish, is being educated by private tutors. The problem is that Martin exists. Martin is living evidence that Cortés kept a long relationship with an indigenous woman. Evidence that Cortés produces mestizo children. Evidence that the blood purity of any future Cortés family line is irreparably compromised. That night, Juana tells Cortés, "That boy cannot stay in this house. This is not a suggestion. This is an ultimatum." Cortés has to choose, and Cortés, as always, chooses what benefits him politically. But he doesn't abandon Martino completely. He can't. The boy has been legitimized before a notary. He carries the Cortés surname legally. He has inheritance rights recognized by Spanish law. So Cortés does something more calculated, something crueler in the long run. A few months later, he tells Martin he's going to Spain, that he's going to receive the best education possible, that he'll study with the same tutors who teach the sons of dukes and counts, and that he'll return a respected Spanish gentleman. He lies. Martin boards a ship in Veracruz. He's 7 years old. He lost his mother only 4 months ago, and now he's being sent alone to a continent he has never seen, 9,000 kilometers away to live among strangers. Imagine it, you're 7. Your mother is gone. Your father puts you alone on a ship toward an unknown world, to live with people who will despise you for the color of your skin. How could you not end up hating that man? The voyage is 2 months of nightmare. Martin vomits every day from the seasickness. He sleeps in a damp hammock that never dries. He eats rock-hard biscuit crawling with weevils. Sailors stare at him with contempt because he's the Indian's son. He arrives in Seville gaunt, sick, terrified, and he is delivered to an Augustinian monastery outside the city. The monastery is called San Leandro, a massive gray stone building surrounded by olive fields. It's cold, always cold. And there in that monastery with no human warmth and no love, surrounded by monks who shout when he makes mistakes, who slap his hands with a ruler when he drifts during Latin lessons, Martin the Mestizo learns 3 things that will shape the rest of his life. 1, he is the son of a powerful man who doesn't want him close. 2, he is mestizo in a world that treats mestizos as second class. 3, he has brothers, many brothers, and all of them want the same thing he wants: Cortés' inheritance. And on freezing nights, while other noble boys sleep in rooms with braziers and thick blankets, Martin the Mestizo trembles under a thin cover in a communal dormitory where wind slips through the windows. He shakes from cold. He shakes from loneliness. He shakes from abandonment. And that childhood cold will turn into adult hatred that consumes decades of his life. Hold on to that image of the shivering child, because that frozen boy will grow into the man who will destroy his Spanish brother almost 4 decades later. While Martín the Mestizo shakes in Spain learning to hate, Juana de Zúñiga gives birth in Mexico. A boy. Cortés looks at the newborn and feels something he never felt with Martín the Mestizo. Shameless pride, uncomplicated joy, love without guilt. This child isn't brown-skinned. This child isn't evidence of an affair with an indigenous slave. This child is the product of a legitimate marriage between a Spanish man and a Spanish noblewoman. And Cortés names him Martín. Again, Martín Cortés. The second Martín, same name, different mother, different skin, a completely different destiny. This Martín is born into absolute wealth. His cradle is carved wood brought from Spain. His blankets are imported silk. His room is inside the palace Cortés built over the ruins of Moctezuma's palace. And from the moment this second Martín opens his eyes, Cortés prepares him to be the primary heir of the Marquisate of the Valley of Oaxaca. But Cortés has a mathematical problem. Two sons with the same name. One mestizo, legitimized years earlier. One Spanish, born in legitimate marriage. So who is the main heir under the law? Under Spanish law, the eldest son has automatic priority, and the eldest is the mestizo. Technically, legally, Martín the Mestizo should inherit the primary title. But Cortés can't accept that. He cannot allow a mestizo to be Marquis of the Valley of Oaxaca. He cannot let his legacy be carried by mixed blood, dashuri. So Cortés starts moving political pieces with the same cunning he used to conquer the Aztec Empire. He begins writing obsessive letters to King Charles III, begging permission to name the younger Spanish son as primary heir instead of the older mestizo son. The king doesn't answer for years, and in that frustrating silence, while he waits, Cortés keeps doing what he does best, making more children. Over the next decade, Cortés has children with at least 4 different women in addition to Juana de Zúñiga. Luis Cortés, another mestizo, son is born to a Tlaxcalan woman. Cortés recognizes him, but never fully legitimizes him, and he treats him exactly the way he treated Martín the Mestizo. He ships him to Spain at 5 years old, puts him in the same monastery, removes him permanently from Mexico and from his mother. Luis arrives at San Leandro years later and finds his older brother Martín the Mestizo there. The two mestizo brothers meet in that cold monastery. Martín is 13, Luis is 5. According to one friar, Martín took the little boy under his protection like he was his own son. The two of them spoke their mother tongue when they thought no one could hear. Martín, after years in Spain, still remembers his mother's language, still clings to the part of himself Cortés tried to erase. The two mestizo brothers form a bond that will last decades, a bond of mutual survival in a world that despises them. But that bond will end in tragedy because Luis won't survive the loneliness and the trauma. Then there is Catalina Cortés, another daughter. Her mother was never officially identified. Cortés recognizes Catalina, but keeps her in Mexico, raised by Spanish wet nurses. She never meets her biological mother. When she asks, they tell her, "She died when you were a baby." At 14, Catalina is still a child, and Cortés marries her off to a 50-year-old Spanish captain. The marriage is consummated violently on the wedding night. A servant testified years later, "Doña Catalina cried every night. She had bruises. She asked me for herbs so she wouldn't get pregnant. She told me her husband hurt her." Catalina tried to abort using herbs she got from indigenous healers. It didn't work. And during the labor 31 hours long, both Catalina and the baby died. She was 16. Cortés was informed while he was in Spain in a meeting with the Council of the Indies. Witnesses say he received the news with a blank face. He did not interrupt the meeting, and 2 days later he signed documents transferring all of Catalina's properties to Martín, the Spaniard like his daughter had never existed. Leonor Cortés, possibly the daughter of an Aztec princess, appears in documents until 1540 and then evaporates from history. No death certificate, no marriage record, nothing. Decades later, a researcher found a letter from a convent in Puebla. Sister Leonor de la Cruz has passed away after 21 years in this convent. She never took perpetual vows due to her questionable origin. She lived in silence. She never received visits. She was buried without a gravestone. Was she Cortés' daughter? The timeline fits perfectly. If it was her, she spent 21 years locked away, no identity, no family, died alone, buried without a name. And while these mestizo children are erased, forgotten, destroyed, the four legitimate children Cortés has with Juana de Zúñiga grow up in Mexico surrounded by absolute luxury, private tutors, imported clothes, meals on silver tableware. The difference in treatment isn't accidental. It's deliberate strategy. Cortés is creating two classes of children, the Spaniards who will inherit power and the mestizos who will be controlled and eventually discarded. And then there's Amadorcito, the definitive ghost child. He appears exactly once, mentioned in a single letter by Cortés. Send suitable clothing as well for my little son Amador. And after that, nothing. As if he stopped existing. Years later, an investigator found a baptism record. Amador, son of an unidentified Spanish father and an unidentified indigenous mother, baptized by Fray Bartolomé de Olmedo, the very friar who served as Cortés's confessor. The record has a note, child transferred to Mexico City by order of HC, and then total silence. The pattern is clear. Cortés had more children than he recognized, and some were actively erased from history. Years later, King Charles I signs a royal decree that changes everything. Ordinances on the descendants of conquistadors in the Indies. Only children of pure Spanish blood can inherit noble titles in the New World. That means Martín the Mestizo cannot inherit the marquisate, technically. But the decree includes an exception. Legitimized mestizo children born before that date may keep secondary rights if the king approves. And Martín the Mestizo was legitimized years earlier. When Cortés receives the decree, he smiles because he understands he has just won. The decree gives him the perfect legal excuse to name Martín the Spaniard as primary heir while reducing Martín the Mestizo to secondary rights. It takes 5 years of political pressure, bribes, and favors owed. But finally, the king signs. Don Martín Cortés, legitimate son, shall inherit the title of Marquis. Don Martín Cortés, natural son, shall receive secondary properties and annual rents. It's official, legal, irrevocable. Martín the Spaniard will inherit the empire. Martín the Mestizo will inherit the scraps. When Martín the Mestizo receives the news, he is 18. He has lived 11 years in Spain, 11 years studying obsessively, 11 years behaving perfectly, 11 years trying to be as Spanish as possible. And he has just learned that none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the color of his skin. Think about it. 11 years of your life trying to prove you're worthy. 11 years being the best student, the most obedient, the most acceptable. And for what? To be told you were never enough and you never will be. That day, Martín the Mestizo makes a decision that will change his life. If he can't inherit the empire by right, he will inherit it by revenge. By patience, by waiting decades if necessary until the perfect moment arrives to destroy his Spanish brother. And that moment will come. It will take almost 3 decades, but it will come. Before we get to that revenge, you need to understand something crucial, something that explains why Martín the Mestizo spends the rest of his life obsessively digging through Spanish monasteries. Because there is a real possibility Malinche did not have only one child with Cortés. There is a possibility she had 2. Go back to a year before Malinche's death. She is seriously ill on her hacienda. High fevers, delirium, vomiting blood, dying. And Malinche, believing she's going to die, begs for an urgent confession. The friar who arrives is Bartolomé de Olmedo. And in that confession, according to Olmedo's personal diary, Malinche says something extraordinary. Marina confessed something that disturbs me. She is delirious with fever, sometimes speaking Spanish and sometimes her native tongue. She says that when she gave birth to the boy Martín, it was not one child, it was 2 twins, but one was born dead, or so they told her. She insists she heard 2 babies cry that night, 2 different cries, but when she woke, only one baby was given to her. She never saw the body of the second. There was no funeral, and for years she has suspected Don Hernán took the second child. A mother knows how many children she delivered. I delivered two, and they only let me keep one. For centuries, historians ignored that passage. They called it fever delirium until a few years ago. A team of geneticists compared DNA from descendants of different Cortés lines and found something they couldn't explain. Genetic markers in the line of Martín the Mestizo that don't appear in any other line. Markers that suggest the existence of a close, undocumented sibling. 5 centuries later, science pushes into the place history tried to silence and finds something that shouldn't be there. The trace of a brother who is recorded nowhere. It's like the body is screaming a secret the documents tried to bury. So researchers begin to search. What happened to the second twin? There is an entry record at the monastery of San Leandro, dated months after Martín the Mestizo arrived. Indigenous child, estimated age 8, no name recorded, delivered by order of an unidentified Spanish knight who paid generously for his upkeep. The child does not speak Spanish, only his native tongue. No name, no father identified, no surname. A child without identity, and the age matches perfectly. If the child was born when Martín was born, he would be 8. So why would Cortés send 2 mestizo children to the same monastery months apart, but recognize only one? Because Martín the Mestizo was manageable, legitimized, documented, named, with rights the law could contain. But the second child, if he existed, was never legitimized, never given a surname. A legal ghost. Cortés hid him so he could never claim anything. Because one legitimized mestizo heir was a problem you could control, 2 would be exponentially harder. The monastery record mentions the indigenous child for a few years, and then nothing. No record of vows, no record of death, no record of anything. He disappears, like Leonor, like Amadorcito, systematically erased. Years later, Cortés returns to Spain. He is 55. His body is wrecked by decades of war. He knows he doesn't have much time. He gathers his sons, Martín the Mestizo, 18, Luis the Mestizo, 10, Martín the Spaniard, 10. It's the first time the 2 Martins meet face to face. Martín the Mestizo sees a light-skinned boy, well-dressed, staring at him with curiosity. Martín the Spaniard sees a brown-skinned young man with eyes that have learned loneliness too early. They don't embrace. Cortés tries to introduce them. Martín, this is your brother. Martín. The irony escapes no one. That night, Cortés begins writing his will. It will take him 7 years to finish. In an intermediate draft, Cortés writes something extraordinary. I acknowledge having undocumented descendants who, for reasons of protection, have not been publicly recognized. To these descendants, if they can prove Cortés' blood, an annual pension shall be assigned. He is admitting he has secret children. That clause does not appear in the final version. It was removed. But the fact he wrote it confirms the truth. Hernán Cortés had more than 11 children, and some were never found. 7 years later, Cortés is dying. He is 62. It is December 1547. In a moment of lucidity, he asks to see Martín the Mestizo. Martín arrives, now 25, walks into the room, closes the door. For 47 minutes, father and son speak alone. No one else is present. Servants hear voices, sometimes loud, sometimes whispers. When Martín the Mestizo comes out, his face is wrecked, white as paper, trembling, like he's about to vomit. He speaks to no one. He leaves the house and disappears. 2 days later, Cortés dies. His last words, I have sinned more than I have built. 3 days later, when the will is read, Martín the Mestizo isn't there. For 6 months, nobody knows where he is, until he reappears in Veracruz, Mexico. What did he do during those 6 months? Why return to Mexico after nearly 2 decades in Spain? He never explains. But 3 years later, a document appears in Mexico City, supposedly a secret addendum to Cortés's will stating that Martín the Mestizo should inherit the main marquisate. The paper carries a signature that looks like Cortés's. It has a notarial seal. Martín the Spaniard calls it a forgery and hires experts. The case drags through courts for 2 years. Finally, a tribunal declares the document of questionable authenticity and without legal validity. Martín the Mestizo loses, but he never admits he forged it. And years later he writes, my father told me the truth in his final minutes, a truth that justifies everything I have done. But that truth died with him. What truth? What did Cortés tell him in those 47 minutes? Martín the Mestizo takes the answer to the grave. But the war between the two Martins is only beginning. Almost 2 decades later, Martín the Spaniard is 35. He is Marquis of the Valley of Oaxaca. He controls more than 23,000 square kilometers. He is one of the most powerful men in the Americas. But the Spanish crown doesn't trust the sons of conquistadors because it fears they believe they have the right to rule independently of Spain. The viceroy begins receiving reports. Martín the Spaniard meets secretly with other sons of conquistadors. They are gathering weapons. They talk about recovering the rights of our fathers. And in one meeting, someone says, "Why don't we become independent?" It isn't a concrete plan, just words of frustration. But someone reports it. And according to later documents, that someone was Martín the Mestizo. He has been watching his brother for years, documenting meetings, building a case. He sends an anonymous letter to the viceroy. The letter lists names, dates, places. It doesn't accuse him directly of treason. It expresses concern about activities that could be misinterpreted. The viceroy takes it seriously. In the early hours of July 8, 1566, soldiers storm Martín the Spaniard's palace. They arrest him on charges of conspiracy to rebel against the crown. They lock him in an Inquisition prison. The torture is psychological, a dark cell, no light. They tell him his friends betrayed him. They show him confessions, naming him as the leader. For 3 months, Martín the Spaniard resists. In October, he finally breaks. He signs a confession admitting he discussed inappropriate ideas. And during his imprisonment, he receives a visit, his mestizo brother. There is no official record of what they said, but the diary of Martín the Mestizo's confessor records this. Don Martín came shattered. He confessed for 2 hours, revealing he had visited his brother in prison. He says his brother begged him to intercede, begged him as a brother. Don Martín answered something about settling a debt of 19 years. Don Martín weeps. I have never seen him weep. I asked if he felt remorse. He told me, "I feel too many things, Father, but remorse is not among them." A debt of 19 years. From the will that favored the Spanish son, 19 years. You could wait 19 years to destroy someone. That isn't impulsive revenge. That is cold, calculated, professional hatred. Martín the Mestizo waited almost 2 decades, and when the moment came, he took it without hesitation. Martín the Spaniard stays in prison for 3 years. The sentence from King Philip II, confiscation of half his properties, permanent deportation to Spain, a ban on returning to Mexico for 20 years, a fine of 100,000 ducats. Martín the Spaniard boards a ship. He is 39. He is a broken man. He lives the rest of his life in Madrid trying to clear his name. He never succeeds. He dies at 59. Before he dies, he writes one final letter to his mestizo brother. It is never sent. "Brother, I know it was you. I know you orchestrated my fall, and now I understand why. You never forgave our father for choosing me. But what you don't know is that in those 47 minutes before he died, our father confessed something to me about you. Something about your mother. Something that, if known, would destroy your entire identity. I could have told you. I could have used it to ruin you the way you ruined me. But I won't. Because unlike you, I am not a monster. I die keeping the secret, and you will live with the ignorance of never knowing what truth about you died with me." What secret? Martín the Spaniard dies without revealing it. And when Martín the Mestizo eventually reads that letter, it intensifies something he has been doing for years, obsessively searching in Spanish monastery archives. Martín the Mestizo is 58. He has outlived his father, his Spanish brother, almost all his siblings. But he isn't at peace. He writes letters, dozens, hundreds to monasteries across Spain, all asking the same question. Do you have records of indigenous children delivered by Hernán Cortés? He hires investigators. He sends his nephew to Spain. He spends fortune searching. He donates 10,000 ducats to the monastery of San Leandro, about 30% of his entire fortune. The condition, the monastery must agree to educate, in perpetuity, mestizo children with no surname and no family, without distinction of racial origin. His friends ask him, why? He answers, I'm paying a debt my father never paid. In a letter, his confessor writes, I have searched for 40 years for someone who may never have existed or who existed and was erased so completely that even God could not find him. But I must keep searching, because if that person existed, if my mother gave birth to two sons, then I was not the only one abandoned. And perhaps by finding him, I will find peace. It's the clearest confession of what he is looking for. A brother, a twin. He never finds the ghost son. Martín the Mestizo dies at 73, without a wife, without children. In his will, all my goods shall be divided, half to the monastery of San Leandro to continue educating Mestizo children without family, the other half to a fund dedicated to seeking unrecognized descendants of Hernán Cortés, who may be in need or anonymity. It is his final search, one that will continue even after his death. While the two Martins fought their war, the other children lived and died in silence. Luis Cortés, the Mestizo, developed what doctors called severe melancholy with episodes of fury. Records describe attacks in which he screamed in a wild tongue, calling for his mother. He was committed to a psychiatric hospital. He died at 30, probably suicide. He died completely alone, mad, crying out for a mother he hadn't seen since he was 5. The legitimate Spanish children. Maria married a nobleman, lived in Extremadura, died at 60 without ever returning to Mexico. In her letters, she never mentions her father. Luis inherited minor properties. The line died out within 2 generations. Catalina entered a convent at 19, died at 70. In 40 years, she did not receive a single family visit. Juana married a duke, but specifically requested that no one ever mention she was Cortés' daughter. She wanted to erase him from her story. Today, almost 500 years later, there are roughly 200 people who can prove direct descent from Cortés. But here's the detail Cortés never would have imagined. 70% descend from mestizo lines. Only 30% descend from pure Spanish lines. Why? The Spanish children lived in Europe, married late, had few children, and several lines died out quickly. But the mestizo children remained in Mexico, married into local families, had many children, and today the majority of Cortés' descendants have predominantly indigenous blood. The irony is perfect. Cortés spent his life trying to establish a pure Spanish dynasty. He hid and erased his mestizo children. And 500 years later, it's the mestizo children he tried to bury who carried his name forward. The inheritance Spain tried to erase is the only one that survived. Cortés conquered an empire, accumulated wealth, founded cities, changed history, but he couldn't conquer something simpler, the love of his own children. He created 11 confirmed and possibly several more secret, but he died alone, bitter, with children who hated him or ignored him. And after his death, his children destroyed one another for decades. The mestizo son, who waited 19 years for revenge, succeeded in destroying his Spanish brother. But he ended alone, without family, without peace, obsessively searching for a ghost brother. But there's something else you need to know about Martín the Mestizo's obsessive search, something he discovered in his final years that destroyed him more completely than any revenge ever could. In 1589, when Martín the Mestizo is 67, he receives a letter from an archivist at the convent of Santa Clara in Puebla, Mexico. The letter is brief and devastating. Don Martín, in response to your search for records regarding indigenous women linked to your father, we have found a document that may interest you. A woman named Malinali entered this convent in 1527. She died here in 1529. She is buried in our cemetery without a gravestone. Martín reads it, and something doesn't fit. His mother died in 1529, he knows that, but his mother was married to Juan Jaramillo, living on a hacienda in Orizaba when she died. How could she have died in a convent in Puebla? Unless the woman who died on the hacienda wasn't Malinche. Martín hires investigators immediately. He gives one specific instruction: find every death record for women named Marina or Malinali between 1527 and 1530. Everyone. What they find is unsettling. There are 3 different death certificates for Marina, indigenous woman. One dated 1528 in Veracruz. Marina, woman of unknown age, deceased of smallpox. Another dated 1529 in Orzaba. Doña Marina, wife of Juan Jaramillo, deceased of fevers. And a third dated 1529 in Puebla. Malinali, converted Indian, deceased in the convent. 3 deaths, 3 places, 3 overlapping dates. How can the same woman die 3 times? Martín the Mestizo spends the next 2 years chasing a theory that consumes him. What if his mother never died in 1529? What if Cortés fabricated her death to hide her? And there's more. The Marina who died on the Orizaba hacienda was buried immediately. No one saw the body, no public funeral, no witnesses beyond 2 servants who worked directly for Cortés. Those 2 servants vanished from historical records immediately afterward, as if they never existed. Martín travels personally to Puebla. He is 68. He's ill. He can barely walk. But he needs to know. He arrives at Santa Clara. The abbess receives him with cold respect. The Cortés name is powerful, even the Mestizo branch. I want to see the records from 1527 to 1530. Every woman who entered, every woman who died. The abbess hesitates. Some records are delicate. I want them all. They bring 3 dusty books. Martín reads for hours until he finds an entry that freezes his blood. Year 1527. A sister without name enters. Indigenous woman, approximately 25 years old. She does not take vows. She lives in an isolation cell by order of the benefactor who pays her maintenance. The benefactor specifies no visitors, no correspondence, no contact with the outside. The woman speaks little Spanish, appears to be in deep mourning. Doctors say she recently lost a child. Lost a child, not children. A single child. Martín keeps reading. Year 1528. The unnamed woman has attempted escape 3 times. She has been restrained. She screams at night. She calls for a boy named Martín. The other sisters fear her. Calls for Martín. His name. Martín's hands tremble so badly he can barely hold the book. Year 1529. The unnamed woman died after refusing food for 2 weeks. Her last words were in her native tongue. She repeated something that sounded like 2, not 1. She was buried in the cemetery without a gravestone, per instructions of the benefactor. The benefactor stopped sending payments immediately after her death. 2, not 1. The same words the friar recorded when Marina died in Orizaba. Martín closes the book, tries to breathe, feels the room spin, and he understands. Cortés locked Malinche in that convent, hid her, isolated her, took her child, and left her to die alone, screaming for a boy she would never see again. Why? Why do that instead of letting her live with her new husband like the official story claims? Martín asks to see the cemetery. The abbess leads him to a back courtyard. There are rotten wooden crosses, some with no markings at all. Which grave is the unnamed woman's? The abbess points to an area where no crosses remain. That section. But after so many centuries, it's impossible to know exactly which grave. Martín the Mestizo kneels in the dirt. He is almost 70. He is crying. Somewhere in this earth mixed with the bones of forgotten nuns is my mother. Forgive me, mother. I never knew. I spent my life hating the wrong man. I should have hated him for what he did to you, not only for what he did to me. He returns to Mexico City and begins writing again. Hundreds of letters to archivists, historians, private investigators. They all seek the same thing. What happened to the second baby? Because now Martín is convinced. Malinche gave birth to twins. Cortés kept one, the one he legitimized, and named him Martín. And he hid the other because 2 legitimized mestizo sons would have been impossible to manage. And then he imprisoned Malinche so she could never reveal the truth. Martín's letters become more desperate with every year. Someone somewhere has to know what happened to the unnamed boy. Someone has to have a record, a baptism note, a margin scribble, something. In 1590, he receives a reply from a monk in Toledo. Don Martín, I have found something. A death record for an unnamed indigenous boy at the monastery of San Leandro. Date, 1536. Estimated age, 14. Cause of death, melancholy and refusal of food. The boy never learned Spanish properly. The monks said he seemed to be waiting for someone who never arrived. His last words were in his native tongue, something about brother. Brother. Martin reads the letter, and something inside him breaks, permanently because he understands. The unnamed boy was waiting for his brother Martin to come for him, waiting for someone to claim him, waiting not to be completely alone in the world. And Martin the Mestizo had been in the very same monastery for years, but he never knew his brother was only meters away, because Cortés made sure the two children would never know each other existed. Two twin brothers separated at birth, living in the same building for years. One with a name, a surname, a future, one with nothing. And the one with no name died waiting for his twin to save him. Martin writes one last letter to the abbot of San Leandro. I need to know where the unnamed boy is buried. I will pay any amount. I will build a mausoleum. I will give him the surname he was denied. Martin Cortés, my brother, my twin. The abbot's reply arrives 3 months later. Don Martin, the unnamed boy, was buried in a common grave with other orphan children and poor monks. There is no way to identify which bones are his. I am deeply sorry. Martin the Mestizo dies 6 months later. He is 73. In his final will, he adds a clause that wasn't in earlier versions. I order that a stone monument be built in the cemetery of the monastery of San Leandro with the following inscription: Here lies a son of Hernán Cortés, whose name was stolen, whose identity was erased, and whose existence was denied. Brother, I found you too late. Forgive me. The monument was built. It still exists today. And every year on the anniversary of Martin the Mestizo's death, descendants of the Cortés family leave flowers at that monument, not for Martin the Mestizo, but for the ghost brother, the nameless child, the lost twin. The son Cortés erased so completely that even his own twin brother lived and died without knowing he existed. And that is the deepest tragedy in this entire story. Not that Martin the Mestizo and Martin the Spaniard destroyed each other, but that there was a third Martin, a twin brother, who died alone, without a name, waiting to be found. And when he was finally discovered, it was too late. It had been too late for more than 50 years. Cortés didn't just destroy the relationship between his children. He destroyed the possibility that two twin brothers could even know they were brothers. He separated them at birth, raised them in the same place without their connection, and let one die believing he was completely alone in the world. When the other finally learned the truth, both were already lost. How many modern families repeat this pattern? Parents who think they can control their legacy by favoring certain children? Parents who believe money and power matter more than real love? Parents who abandon some children while overprotecting others? And what happens? The same thing that happened with Cortés. The favored children grow weak. The abandoned children grow destructive. And in the end, everyone loses. Because a surname without love is just an empty word that gets forgotten. But the pain of abandonment lasts for generations. If this story made you think about inheritance, family, and the consequences of the choices we make with our children, hit like and subscribe. And you, what do you think? Do you think Martin the Mestizo was right to take revenge after nearly 2 decades? Or by destroying Martin the Spaniard, did he only destroy himself? Do you think the ghost child, the possible lost twin, really existed? Or is it just a legend created by grief? And the question that defines this entire tragedy: who was Hernán Cortés' true favorite? The Mestizo's son he legitimized first and then abandoned? The Spanish son he protected legally but couldn't save? Or neither, because Cortés never truly loved any of his children? He only used them as pawns in his obsession with building a legacy that failed, ironically, anyway. Because in the next story, you'll see how another Spanish conquistador made the exact same mistakes with his children, but with an even bloodier ending. An ending where the children didn't just destroy each other legally and politically, they murdered each other.